Thank you very much, Donald. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Joe, Matthew, the organizing committee this year. And thank you, my dear colleagues, also for being here to the end, or to now at least. So as you may read, or you may have read in my abstract, if you have had the time to read it or to have a look at it, probably not. I wasn't very sure what I would be talking about today. I'm not very sure yet, but I try to be brief, at least. I'm not sure either. So what I want to do is begin by talking a little bit about the idea of normalcy. Let's see. Is this working? Yeah. Yeah, normalcy, and then move on to talk a little bit about care and literature. Yeah, okay, I can do this. So regarding normal, the new normal is the topic of the conference. I am somewhat confounded regarding the idea of normalcy. While I was trying to find ways to formalize my ideas about this word, about this concept, I came across a label in a T-shirt which read, "Be normal." Be normal, what did this mean? Was the T-shirt inviting me to be like everybody else? Was it inviting us who would wear it to emphasize our similarities to one another? Of course, that kind of standardized people is pretty much what we become in this consumerist system that we are part of. But I was surprised to find such an idea thus exposed in a label. It seemed to me a bit of a counterproductive advertisement, as we all want to be original, don't we? In any event, the answer to that label, and they undoubtedly, is no, we don't want this kind of standardization, this kind of normal. Rather, we cherish difference, diversity, heterogeneity, the genuine, motley, and sundry which characterize the human race and the whole modern human world, for that matter. And we don't want to be normal if normal means keep buying T-shirts, just wearing them a couple of times and discarding them, because that's the normal thing to do, and run to buy another T-shirt or piece of clothes produced in distant countries' sweatshops. But again, the idea of normal is manifold, because against the consumerist system, kind of normal, we can confront the version that educationist Sidney Rondo puts forward in an article which bears an eloquent title, "Make Nature the New Normal, Renewing the Case for Nature-Based Education," and which features photographs such as this one, or this, or this, or this. This refreshing focalization on nature that Randall proposes in her text refers to the new normal as we understand it today, probably, which is what we are trying to get back to after this dreadful pandemic that we have gone through. But also in the context of pandemics or post-pandemics is the idea of normal confusing. If normal means regular and homogeneous in the sense that everybody may enjoy similar economic conditions and possibilities, then yes, we want that. But we reject the abnormalcy that during the pandemic, all around the world, certain communities should have suffered inordinately more than others because of the dismal inequalities that plague our societies. All in all, given the complex condition in which we are bound to live these days, these troubled days, I suggest that in constructing whatever kind of new normal, we envision and thrust towards what I could call a normalcy of care. Of course, this is not my invention. Care has always existed in any human society, but in ours, dominated by neoliberal forms of economic production and socio-cultural reproduction, we are seriously disregarding this principle. That is the need to care for one another, which should dominate our lives if we want to survive as a species or whatever we are. So let me comment briefly on this and thus move on to the second part of my paper. Political scientist Joan Tronto, among other scholars, has contributed to defining the by now sophisticated construct of the ethics of care. Surely the most popular definition of caring provided by Tronto and Bernice Fisher some years ago is this one. On the most general level, we suggest that caring can be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. The idea of the normalcy of care, which I have proposed here, which I propose, seems to coincide with a still more attractive one, that is the promiscuity of care. This is an idea promoted by several European scholars who call themselves the Care Collective and who in 2020 published a pamphlet that you can see here, the Care Manifesto. In nowadays, unfortunately, despite the ubiquity of the term care, the Care Collective denounced that the world continues to be governed by a lack of care, by carelessness. And this pamphlet is written precisely with the purpose of contributing to reversing that situation. Their main complaint is that unbridled neoliberalism, which puts all its energy into the production accumulation of wealth, because one thing goes with the other in our world, this has caused irreparable damage to our societies and to the planet. Neoliberalism is careless by its very nature. And we live in a world governed by what this collective call the banality of carelessness, in an expression inspired by Hannah Arendt. An instance of this ubiquitous banality of carelessness is, for instance, the fact that we have become used to receiving news of terrible disasters with astounding impassivity, with total carelessness. And these disasters are always caused directly or indirectly by the excesses of that crazed, accumulative and exploitative kind of capitalism. According to the Care Collective, this is the core problems shown to us in a multitude of incarnations. In the name of wealth accumulation, governments have favored the privatization of a large part of the economy, which results in low wages, impossible hours, and workers being neglected around the world. In the social sphere, the current system of production and organization, and that's of particular interest for us today, favors individual isolation. And thus we live in forms of what the Care Collective calls social systems of organized loneliness, which hinder association initiatives for social improvement from below. The glorification of the family as a fundamental and basically autonomous social unit is but another symptom of this perverse social agenda, since it limits the free circulation of care among people, reserving it to just a chosen few. Just as abnormal as this, they claim, are populisms, animal abuse, ecological aggressions, and all kinds of social inequalities. Faced with forms of programmed atomization that distance us so much from what some indigenous communities call the good living, that is harmony with the earth, and from the idea we have just read that care is a form of maintaining and repairing our world so that we can live as well as possible, the Care Manifesto suggests that we need to gain awareness of the fact that we are totally dependent on one another in order to survive. Its structure draws on the classic idea of care circles proposed by care ethicist Nell Noddings years ago and by others later on, who have advocated applying collaboration and care in all our spheres of action, beginning in our smallest daily gestures and expanding them in concentric circles of ever-widening scope: family, friends, kin, professional relations, community or nation, state, transnational care. Thus, the manifesto is not limited to denouncing the banality of carelessness that plagues the societies we live in, but also points towards solutions like reimagining the limits of familial care to encompass more expansive or promiscuous models of kinship, reclaiming forms of genuinely collective and communal life, adopting alternatives to capitalist markets, resisting the marketing of care and care infrastructures, restoring, invigorating, and radically deepening our welfare states, and finally, mobilizing and cultivating radical cosmopolitan conviviality, porous borders, and Green New Deals at the transnational level. In definitive, Joan Tronto's proposal to care with, which means building caring democracies with the appropriate caring institutions and structures, The collective proposes a social revolution that centers around the concept of care, and where care has to be a priority, and where we need to consider that all otherness is kinship, both that of any other human being and also any inanimate entity of the world or other animate entities. In order to build a global alliance of care connections, as they put it, we must cultivate an ethics of promiscuous care at all levels, in all circles, rejecting all forms of domination or mastery. My claim at this point is that literature is an excellent way of educating ourselves into care, particularly into an ethics of promiscuous care. There would be many ways to illustrate the connections between care and literature, such as talking about works of literature that tackle caring matters, or talking about bibliotherapy, or about the figure of the literary mediators, that especially those who go to places that have been ravaged by catastrophes, and they go there to comfort the people who have lost everything through the means of books and reading. But I have chosen today to tell you a bit of a personal story. As described, and this is the third part of my paper, as described by Ellis, Adams, and Buckner, autoethnography is an approach to research and writing that seeks to describe and systematically analyze, graphe, personal experience, auto, in order to understand cultural experience, ethno. Then autoethnography, it may be what I'm going to tell you, as it is my intention to briefly explain, graphe, how poetry exerted a decisive influence on my overall well-being, auto, during the period in which I went through a serious disease, and how I have continued to use literature as a conscious form of care for others ever since then, ethno. In this brief autoethnography, I will briefly open 3 capsules. I don't know whether this is okay. And the first one would be translation. And this begins, if I'm right, with a quote by Susan Sontag, who says, "Illness is the nocturnal side of life, a more expensive citizenship. At birth, we are all granted dual citizenship, that of the kingdom of the healthy and that of the kingdom of the sick. And although we prefer to use the good passport, sooner or later, each of us is forced to identify ourselves, at least for a time, as a citizen of that other place." In 2017, I was diagnosed with an illness that I have often called the C word. Since that moment and until recovery, normalcy was for me out of the question. I inevitably passed to the nocturnal side of life. Like surely all of you who have undergone this situation, I was taken aback what to do in that blank period which opened before me until recovery. And then I remembered Cheran's poems. Cheran is a Tamil poet whom the war in Sri Lanka forced to exile in Canada decades ago. Translating his extraordinary poems seemed to me at that moment to be a possible way to ward off a situation that overwhelmed me in every way. In a text I would write later on, I had a chance to explain this. And I wrote there, "Can't you see there's nothing in me that is not in all of you," wrote James Baldwin. Thus, pain reverberates in these poems to remind us readers what we have in common. We seem to rise above our animal condition with symbolic gestures of civilization, only to show our true nature in irrational wars, ignoring compassion. Fortunately, life thrives against the odds. In Cheran's poems, resilience sprouts between the cracks of war destruction, like a timid but decided edelweiss. Life prevails. This lesson I learned while translating the poems and fighting the disease. Translating poetry had a calming effect on me. On the one hand, how not to feel at an advantage over innocent people who have suffered a ravaging war which has often robbed them of everything. The dimension of so many tragedies far exceeds the drama caused by the illness. Translating those poems helped me stay calm and relativize restlessness. Further, the economy of the poetic genre makes it particularly appropriate for the situation because, despite its technical difficulties, it is generally composed of short pieces. And this gives the translator the immediate satisfaction of a finished work. When you live side by side with the C word, time turns into immediacy, and the present moment gains a significance that we often steal from it in the hectic kingdom of normalcy. Translating poetry in this context has special beauty and significance. My second capsule is writing. In an article about the work of three poets who are terminally ill, poet and philologist Denise Leon writes, most of the injured or sick bodies, innumerable and violated in the most varied possible ways, cannot transcend as individuals the social space in which they live. However, some injured bodies, dragging their pain, their illness, and their impotence, are besieged by words. They become objects of a cultural construction that gradually transform them into poems, symbolic representations, living words. I think this happened to me in those days, that my body was besieged by the word, almost despite myself. While living with the C word, I wrote some thoughts that can probably hardly be called poems, but that comforted me enormously. They compiled a jumble of emotions, ideas, and feelings that after the hurricane, I decided to put together in a small self-published volume, which I called In Praise of the Subbird and Other Poems from Breast Cancer. Translated with a similar title, and that was illustrated by visual artist Sabrina Atanasio. I decided on that self-treat because the C word carries with it the philosophy of maximum possible satisfaction. This carpe diem imperative is closely related to that other imperative of immediacy that I was mentioning before. An urgency for living more and better takes over everything. And seeing my poems in print was a kind of a reward, a little reward for whatever. The title seeks to highlight the metaphoric relationship between the difficult balance of sailing a surfboat with the vulnerability of the sick person. And this is one of the poems, but I think I am going to skip it. And if there is enough time, we may go back to it. Perhaps, I will leave it for later. I believe that the common denominator of the poems in praise of the subbird is the simple celebration of the moment, the praise of a vital beat that is embodied in each second. The sick person clings to it as a castaway would cling to a wooden plank in the middle of the ocean, no matter how coarse and rough it may be. In my fantasy, the art of surfing requires a composure and serenity metaphorically comparable to that needed when fully aware that one's life is in check. This is a second poem, and I think I can read it. Caesura, I was purloined from the claws of death. Will you believe it? I was ruined, I was dread, I was whimper. I was almost nothing, but I was purloined from the claws of death. I now live divided between grace and lightness, and the fright of the odds that, like a ravenous creature, might return. The horror. Thus, two embodiments of literature, translation and writing, became caring tools when I needed them most. In those long moments when, as Virginia Woolf formulated it, the general panorama of life lies remote and far. Is as remote as beautiful as the coast seen from a ship on the high seas. Yeah, this is the quote. Let me then open the third and last capsule of my presentation. Communities of literature and care. To finish these spare thoughts, I want to share with you with enthusiasm the beginning of a new journey of my day-to-day activities, which consists of the stimulation of what can be called a community of literature and care. This community is the result of the poetry workshops for people with cancer, survivors, and relatives that, after my own struggle with the C word, I began to organize within the Spanish Association for against cancer. The late poet Julia Darling, who died of breast cancer in 2005, was adamant that poetry is essential, not a frill or a nice stay, echoing an idea put forward earlier on by another great poet who had also succumbed to the C word, Audre Lorde, and who famously wrote that poetry is not a luxury. Regarding sickness and the C word, Darling explained, one of the hardest things about being unwell is feeling disempowered and out of control. Writing poetry can make you feel in charge again. This is what I try to promote in those communities of literature and care, empowering people who have lost their ordinary sense of normalcy, and crucially, try to make them feel better about the situation and about themselves through writing. Heaps of care circulate in those poetry workshops in multiple, multi-directional, multifarious ways. The results of these gatherings are not only of a material nature, like the one I'll be sharing with you promptly in a minute. These meetings also provide us, and this is their main benefit, with large doses of emotional well-being, difficult to quantify. Among the material results of the workshop, I wish to share a poem with the permission of its author, Nuria Garcia, a woman who wrote it. There's another quote here. Who wrote this poem when she was going through the most critical moments of chemotherapy treatment for breast cancer. The poem has no title, and I have translated it myself. It's not a very good translation, but it tries to respect the kind of rhythm or rhyme of the original in Spanish. Having cancer is not easy, but neither is it so bad. Time turned eternal. I can sleep and I can walk. Stop to do what? When? In what way? To do nothing. To breathe. Like the tree. Like the river zigzags to the sea. Having cancer is not easy if you live in the city. There's no green, there's no sky. I'm lucky and can't run away. I'm nostalgic for the forest and for the smell of damp. I often fantasize with burying myself and sprouting as a new Nuria full of strength. My eyes loaded with stars and who can finally be calm. I'm coming to my end now. Each in their own way, the participants in the poetry workshop, we are people wounded by pain, uncertainty, and fear. But in this poem by Nuria, vulnerability is colored by hope. It has been researched that while both music and literature succeed in stimulating and helping sick people, the poetic genre manages to increase hope in them in a more palpable and even quantifiable way. To conclude, in the precious and fragile creature, which is our poetry workshop, our cherished literature and care small community, poetry helps us cultivate a sense of normalcy, whatever it may mean in that context, in the context where, again, a fissure separates us from the healthy, the salubrious, against the imperatives of organized loneliness, dictated by neoliberal words, and the extra difficulties of living, as Susan Sontag put it, dangerously close to the night side of life. I believe that we succeed in cultivating a sweet and rebellious promiscuity of care. And this is my talk, but I would like to dedicate it to the poet Marta Agudo, who lost the battle to the C word in April this year. We were classmates at the University of Barcelona back in the early 90s. And although we never met again afterwards, I keep fond memories of her wisdom and charisma, and I wanted to dedicate this talk to her memory. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I would ask maybe if I could take the privilege. Could you talk maybe about because this is an education conference, about perhaps a pedagogy of care and what that...
Very interesting. I have to say, yes, I have to say, I don't know much about that. Actually, I only received a book about new pedagogies of care in tertiary education last week. So that's a very interesting question. This is part of a longer paper where actually I also reflect upon my new attitude towards work, and precisely what I comment there is that I normally try to be, I always try, as we probably all do, to be particularly careful with students and attentive to them. But certainly after the pandemic, I think we have all, one way or another, needed to be particularly careful towards students and particularly attentive to the needs, to the well-being in all kinds of ways. And I think that we are more explicit in this regard than we were before. So that's, for instance, I don't know you, but in my case, that's something I make explicit when we began. So not only have I incorporated care as a crucial element of my teaching in the same way as gender, for instance, but also I am explicit about the need for them to feel cared and to voice any kind of discomfort and to really cultivate this.
Do you think there's a reciprocity that's expected? In other words, we found, at least in some universities in the U.S., that some of our students, not all, but some of our students can become very, very, I don't want to say needy, but very dismissive of us in the classroom as teachers. And at times bordering on rudeness. Like, I don't need this, I don't want this, I don't want to participate in this. So do you ever set those expectations of reciprocity of care?
I have to say that I only started very recently, and actually, well, we started the academic year last week, and today, I came late because I had a class before, and we were still discussing these matters. And of course, they were very surprised because, well, I teach post-colonial studies, but I sort of introduced the whole idea of care, also from a theoretical perspective and so on. And it was received with surprise. But I think I started last week, and today we took up on that conversation, and I felt it was very welcome, and it was somehow mulling down the atmosphere. So I have good hopes that it may help. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the paper, because it opened up a number of areas that perhaps we should all be thinking about more. And from what Donald just said, but taking it from another angle, the care, if you are not well, you have to care for yourself, and you've learned that caring for others is perhaps another way of doing it. And I wonder if that doesn't bring up what we've talked about in other senses here today, the interdependence, that we all need each other. We're all part of the same thing. And if we don't learn that, caring for ourselves, caring for others, it's not really very different in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. Indeed. I think the word interdependence appeared only once today, but it's very important. And in the class, we insist on that idea, the idea of collaboration, interdependence, community, and these kind of things. But yes, thank you. And the idea of self-care is also a very big issue in our societies as well, how that is practiced and the kind of perversion that we often see regarding self-care.
And it's not selfish to care for oneself.
No, it is not.
It's part of the whole thing. Because we're part.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your work and for being brave and sharing your poetry. I was also really taken by the art. What kind of relationship did you have with the artist? It was almost like she was a part of you.
Excuse me, the relationship with?
The artist.
The last? The artist. Oh, yes, I didn't mention it. I'm sorry, I didn't mention it, but she's my daughter.
Ah.
Yes, I was I nearly said that, but then I thought I'll say that in the end, and then I forgot. Yes, she's my daughter.
It just seemed like the art was very much a part of your story.
Thank you. I will tell her. Thank you.